"Arrest her, she vandalized community property." That's exactly what Elaine Collins shouted at the officers while my wife stood there with nothing more incriminating than a shiny new padlock in her hands. Emily had simply replaced the rusted, useless lock on the gate leading to our family's lake cabin. Our gate. Somehow, that ordinary act spiraled into flashing sirens, lights reflecting off the water, and half the neighborhood gawking at us like we were suspects in a crime drama. My gut twisted as I tried to decide whether to laugh at the ridiculousness or shout at the unfairness of it all. The day had started quietly enough. Emily was on the deck, sipping coffee and sketching ideas for her students' art projects. I was checking the gate that connected our property to the main lake road. The old lock had been dangling there for months, barely held together by rust since we inherited the place from my grandfather. I always meant to replace it but never quite got around to it. Emily had finally grown tired of fighting with the thing every time we visited, so she drove into town and bought a new padlock, just a plain, working one that actually opened with a key. I was in the kitchen making breakfast when the sound of sirens tore through the morning. Not just one, but 3 patrol cars barreled down our quiet road, their noise echoing across the lake in that unsettling way that makes your heart drop. When I stepped outside, I saw Emily near the gate with the old broken lock in one hand and the packaging from the new one in the other. Right behind her stood Elaine Collins, our HOA president, pointing at the scene like Emily had just toppled a monument. Elaine was in full performance mode, arms flailing, voice raised, accusing my wife of destroying community property. All the while, Emily clutched a $20 lock, looking like she'd been caught red-handed in some imaginary heist. The sight of 3 patrol cars circling her over a routine lock replacement was surreal. Her cheeks flushed, not from anger but from the humiliation of being treated like a criminal in front of the neighbors. The first officer out of his care, Martinez, his name Agrita, took one look at the situation with a weary expression of someone realizing they'd been called to something that clearly wasn't an emergency. Elaine rushed over to him, breathlessly rattling off accusations about unauthorized modifications and compromising community safety. I had to lean on the porch rail to steady myself. Was this woman really equating a hardware store purchase with endangering the neighborhood? Emily gave me that look every husband knows, the one that says, "If you had fixed this when you were supposed to, we wouldn't be in this mess." Officer Martinez calmly asked Elaine to clarify what crime she thought had been committed, and she pointed to the gate like it was a crime scene. She declared Emily had no authority to change locks without HOA approval. When the officer turned to me, I explained that the gate sat on our private property, leading only to our cabin. To prove it, I fetched the property deed from Insidia, my grandfather's papers showing the gate well within our boundary line. Elaine's face soured as Martinez read it. Realizing her case was unraveling, she tried insisting the gate served the whole community, but the officer was already shaking his head. Another officer stepped in and told her this was a civil HOA issue, not a criminal matter, definitely not something to justify multiple emergency units. He even warned her that abusing 911 could itself be a problem. Elaine's face turned a deep shade of purple as she protested, but it was clear the officers were done entertaining her theatrics. Martinez logged the incident, noting that no crime had been committed and no charges would be filed. Emily showed him the useless old lock, which practically crumbled when touched, proving the replacement was just common sense upkeep. The officers confirmed it was standard maintenance, not vandalism or theft. Once they drove off, Elaine lingered in our driveway for another 10 minutes, scolding us about community rules while Emily and I quietly wondered what kind of mess we had inherited along with this cabin. Later that evening, I called my friend Sheriff Anderson to tell him the whole story. He actually laughed and said it sounded like someone had wildly exaggerated when calling dispatch, making routine lock repair sound like a criminal act. He suggested I file a request for the 911 recording to hear exactly what Elaine had told them. That idea stuck with me. What had she said to get 3 patrol cars racing down a quiet lake road? A few days later, I had the recording in hand, evidence that the emergency call meant to put my wife in handcuffs might instead be the very thing that unraveled Elaine's crusade. A few days later, the county sent us a CD containing the 911 recording and a full transcript of Elaine's call. That night, Emily and I sat at our kitchen table, Listening to it over and over before either of us could form a coherent thought, Elaine had told the dispatcher there were suspicious people at our cabin, claiming strangers were tampering with security equipment and possibly vandalizing community property with tools. She even suggested multiple units be dispatched because of the supposed threat. But halfway through our second listen, Emily gripped my arm. When the dispatcher asked about Elaine's connection to the property, she casually mentioned her husband, Robert Collins, and his company Lakefront Development Solutions. She framed the whole situation as a matter of community safety tied to ongoing development projects in the area. In doing so, she basically admitted on a recorded emergency linear that her call had more to do with business interests than public safety. That revelation set off alarm bells. Emily immediately pulled out her laptop and started digging. While she researched Robert's company, I replayed the section where Elaine referenced specific projects in our area. What we uncovered was chilling. According to state business filings, Robert Collins had several large-scale projects lined up for our stretch of shoreline. His company specialized in acquiring adjacent properties, tearing down existing structures, and converting them into luxury resorts for wealthy vacationers and corporate retreats. Their entire business model depended on securing long, uninterrupted sections of lakefront. Emily found the real kicker in the county's planning and zoning database. Lakefront Development Solutions had already submitted preliminary plans for a massive resort complex complete with hundreds of luxury suites, a golf course designed by a celebrity architect, and a marina for yachts. And right there in the documents, clear as day, was a reference to our cabin property. Access to the main road ran through our gate, and the plans described our lot as essential to the success of the project. We looked at each other across the kitchen table, both realizing this had nothing to do with an HOA squabble over a lock. We had stumbled into a multi-million-dollar development scheme, and our cabin was the final piece standing in the way. That weekend, we tore through my grandfather's old files for answers. He'd been a meticulous record keeper, and tucked away in his papers we discovered correspondence with the county planning office going back to the early 80s. It turned out our cabin had been granted special zoning protections decades earlier, meaning developers couldn't force us to sell or bulldoze through our land for road access. Those protections were permanent and legally binding. Emily dug deeper and uncovered even more damning information. In public records, she found Robert Collins's communications with investors, where he bragged about systematically buying up lakefront properties. Over the past 2 years, he had offered owners far above market value to entice them into selling. One by one, families had accepted his offers except us. Our cabin was the lone holdout preventing him from controlling the entire shoreline. Emily printed everything she found and laid the documents across our kitchen table like a case file. The resort plans were undeniably impressive on paper: hundreds of luxury suites, a golf course, and marina facilities designed for high-end clientele. But the project would transform our quiet, generational community into a playground for tourists and drive out long-term residents. I could understand why Robert wanted our land. What I couldn't wrap my head around was why Elaine thought abusing 911 would somehow push us to sell. That's when Emily noticed something I had completely overlooked: the timing. Elaine had been elected HOA president 3 years earlier, at the exact same period Robert's company began quietly buying up properties. Before that, Elaine had worked as a city clerk for over 2 decades. She knew the ins and outs of zoning law and code enforcement. And according to Emily's research, every family who sold to Robert's company had faced sudden waves of HOA violations and fines in the months leading up to their decision to leave. Elaine had been running a harassment campaign disguised as community enforcement. It hit us then our situation wasn't about a rusty lock or HOA rules. We were the last obstacle between Elaine, her husband, and a multi-million-dollar resort empire. And she was willing to weaponize emergency services to get rid of us. The proof arrived Monday morning. Elaine herself showed up on our porch, clipboard in hand, snapping photos of our cabin while we were still in our bathrobes with coffee mugs. She handed over our first official HOA violation notice, not about the lock, but claiming our deck railings were too low and our shoreline fire pit violated environmental rules. Elaine wasn't just enforcing rules anymore, she was inventing brand new violations to justify constant harassment of our property. I started to wonder if HOA boards actually had the power to fabricate rules on the spot whenever they wanted to pressure a homeowner into moving. The next morning, things escalated again. Emily headed out for her usual jog only to find 2 cars parked across our driveway, completely blocking access to the road. Standing beside them was Elaine, arms folded like a security guard, declaring that the HOA had implemented temporary traffic measures while our supposed violations were under investigation. When Emily asked how long we'd be trapped in our own driveway, Elaine coolly replied that it depended on our cooperation and immediate compliance with the violation notices. Emily was so furious she had to call me outside rather than risk saying something she'd regret. I confronted Elaine directly, telling her that blocking our driveway wasn't an HOA rule, it was trespassing and unlawful restraint. If she didn't move the cars, she could face criminal charges. Elaine doubled down, claiming the HOA had the authority to restrict traffic for safety purposes. But when I asked for proof, she had nothing. Emily began snapping photos of license plates while I phoned Sheriff Anderson to report the illegal blockade. By that point, it felt like Elaine was pushing us on purpose, hoping we lose our temper and give her grounds to call the police again. The very next day, another stunt appeared taped to our front door. A fine notice claiming we owed $3,700 in penalties for a laundry list of bogus violations, everything from unauthorized gate modifications to improper shoreline use. Emily called the number on the notice and got a slick, automated message that sounded official but connected to no real person. It became obvious Elaine was inventing financial pressure in hopes we'd panic and sell. On Thursday, she shifted tactics again, this time turning the neighbors against us. Elaine went door to door collecting signatures on a petition demanding action against our cabin. By the time we heard about it, she'd convinced a dozen families to sign, telling them our non-compliance was endangering their kids and lowering their property values. When Emily and I visited some of the signers, most admitted they didn't actually know what violations we were accused of. They just trusted Elaine's word. The breaking point came when our elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, apologized for signing. She confessed Elaine had told her our cabin was falling apart and could collapse into the lake during winter storms. Emily lost Ida standing in Mrs. Patterson's driveway, demanding to know how Elaine could spread blatant lies about a house that had stood strong for decades. That night, Emily organized our growing pile of evidence: fake notices, driveway blockades, photos, and now false statements made to vulnerable neighbors. It was no longer neighborhood drama, it was systematic harassment with financial motives. Emily argued we needed a lawyer, and she was right. This wasn't about HOA rules anymore. It was about protecting our inheritance from targeted intimidation. Later that evening, Sheriff Anderson called me back with some unsettling confirmation. His department had seen similar complaints about Elaine from other families, but most of them gave up and sold before the situation reached this level. He warned us to prepare for more escalation. Elaine, he explained, knew harassment worked faster than negotiations. Our cabin had become a test case in how far she was willing to go. By the weekend, Emily was digging even deeper. She spent hours on the phone with county offices verifying that the inspectors Elaine kept mentioning, a man named Jerry Morrison and Mark Stevenson, didn't work for any real government agency. In fact, impersonating officials was a federal crime. That meant Elaine wasn't just harassing USA, she was potentially setting herself up for felony charges. We started documenting everything meticulously, knowing this might end in court. Sure enough, Monday morning brought Elaine's boldest move yet. She marched up to our cabin with 2 men in uniforms who introduced themselves as municipal compliance officers. They claimed they had legal documents requiring us to appear in court for multiple safety violations. One called himself Agent Martinez, the other Agent Davis. They handed me what looked like a genuine court order complete with seals, citations, and language about possible property seizure if we didn't comply. For a moment, my stomach dropped. If this was real, it meant Elaine had found a way to turn her harassment into official legal action. Losing in court could clear the way for Robert Collins's resort project permanently. But Emily wasn't so easily fooled. With her paralegal background, she spotted problems immediately. The paper stock, formatting, and language weren't quite right. Something about those orders felt off. and she knew what authentic court documents looked like. Emily quickly spotted flaws in the supposed court order. The case numbers didn't match the standard format used in our county, and the judge's signature looked off compared to official documents she'd handled before as a paralegal. She pressed Agent Martinez for additional credentials and contact information to verify the hearing with the court clerk. His discomfort was obvious as she dug into procedural details he couldn't explain. That's when Emily made the call that tripped apart Elaine's most daring fraud. She contacted the municipal court directly using the number on the document, asking the clerk to confirm both the case number and the hearing scheduled for our property. After a short hold, the chief clerk got on the line and flatly stated no case had been filed against us. The case number didn't exist, and neither Martinez nor Davis were employed by the court. They had no legal authority to serve documents or represent judicial proceedings. Emily ended the call with fury in her eyes. Elaine had staged a fake legal ambush. As she confronted the imposters, a cameraman appeared out of nowhere, filming the scene. It was immediately clear Elaine had tipped off the media, hoping to capture what looked like a legitimate legal takedown of our property. The cameraman tried to frame the moment as a dramatic enforcement action, but Emily outsmarted them. She loudly declared on camera that the documents were forged and that the so-called agents were committing a crime by impersonating officials. She even put the municipal court back on speakerphone so neighbors and the cameraman could hear the clerk confirm the fraud. The cameraman quickly realized he had been set up and stopped recording. Martinez and Davis bolted to their car, abandoning the fake documents and their props in their rush to escape. Elaine stood frozen in our driveway, her entire scheme unraveling in front of neighbors and the media she had invited. Instead of humiliating us, she had publicly exposed her own criminal operation. Emily immediately secured the abandoned evidence while I documented everything with photographs of fake seals, forged court letterhead, and fraudulent paperwork that went far beyond a neighborhood dispute. Detective Morrison arrived soon after, alerted by Sheriff Anderson when Emily reported the impersonation. She confirmed this was a federal offense. Impersonating court officers carried far heavier consequences than pretending to be local inspectors. Elaine had crossed a line into dangerous criminal territory. The weekend gave us space to regroup and research further. Emily contacted county offices to double-check whether any of Elaine's officials were legitimate. None of them were. Every single one was a fabrication. And impersonating government officials wasn't just a local violation, it was a federal crime. This was no longer petty harassment. Elaine was operating in felonious territory. That Monday, Elaine doubled down with her boldest stunt yet. We discovered a lien notice taped to our cabin door, demanding $8,400 in alleged HOA fines, penalties, and administrative fees. It threatened property seizure if payment wasn't made immediately. The document looked convincing at first: a county seals, formal legal language, even foreclosure timelines. But when Emily and I examined it on our kitchen table, it became obvious this was another forgery. The notice listed retroactive fines for supposed violations we'd never been informed about, some dating back to before we even inherited the property. Emily quickly spotted discrepancies in the formatting, fonts, seal placements, and language that betrayed it as a sophisticated fake. She documented everything while I called the county clerk's office, who confirmed no liens existed against our property. The document was pure fiction, created with stolen letterhead and forged signatures. This time, Emily decided exposure was the best defense. She organized a live stream for our neighbors and surrounding communities, setting up our deck with the lake behind her like a broadcast studio. She displayed the forged lien notice, the fake inspection badges, and other fraudulent documents while walking viewers through each detail of Elaine's campaign. She explained how simple checks like verifying case numbers with the court clerk could prevent families from falling victim to fabricated debts and seizure threats. The live stream drew over 300 viewers, with neighbors sharing it across nearby communities. Many chimed in with their own accounts of suspicious HOA practices. Emily's presentation turned Elaine's scheme into a cautionary lesson for everyone watching. This wasn't just about our property anymore, it was about protecting families everywhere from organized fraud disguised as community enforcement. Detective Morrison arrived just as Emily's live stream wrapped up, her presence a sign of how serious the situation had become. She examined the forged lien documents we'd uncovered and addressed the live-stream audience directly, explaining that counterfeiting county letterhead wasn't just a local issue, it was a federal offense that would trigger FBI involvement. Morrison made it clear this was no longer a matter of neighborhood disputes. The evidence pointed to an organized conspiracy aimed at seizing property through intimidation and fraudulent legal authority. She announced that the federal investigation would now widen to include other families who'd been targeted by similar tactics. Emily closed out the stream, urging neighbors to step forward with any questionable documents or enforcement threats they had experienced, especially if those involved claims of government backing. Almost immediately, several neighbors approached Morrison with their own accounts of phony violation notices, inflated fines, and suspicious repair demands that had drained their savings or forced costly changes to their homes. For the first time, it felt like the tide was turning. Emily's willingness to go public had sparked a community-wide awakening, exposing years of unchecked abuse disguised as legitimate HOA enforcement. That night, Morrison called us with a pivotal update. The investigation had officially expanded to include conspiracy charges. Elaine's forged lien provided airtight evidence of ongoing criminal activity, strong enough to suggest connections beyond her and Robert. Morrison warned that this wasn't the work of a single rogue board member. It looked like part of a larger network of property fraud spanning multiple neighborhoods. She also cautioned us that Elaine, now cornered, might escalate with direct threats or even property damage as the federal net tightened around her. By Friday, we were hit with another maneuver. Emily found a notice in our mailbox announcing an emergency home meeting for Sunday evening, with our cabin singled out by address. The letter claimed our property posed risks to both safety and property values, citing serious community concerns. It was obvious Elaine was pivoting to formal HOA procedures, hoping to legitimize what her fraudulent schemes had failed to accomplish. We spent Saturday preparing. Emily compiled all of our evidence into a structured timeline showing the escalation from fake inspections and forged documents to impersonations and criminal intimidation. She assembled copies of 911 recordings, photographs of the bogus credentials, and summaries of the fraudulent notices so neighbors could see the full picture. Together, we designed a presentation meant not just to defend ourselves, but to educate the community about how deeply Elaine's misconduct ran. When Sunday arrived, the community center was overflowing with more attendees than we'd seen in all the years since inheriting the cabin. Elaine had clearly worked hard to pack the room, transforming the meeting into what looked more like a staged courtroom drama. Enlarged photos of our cabin were displayed on easels, charts of supposed violations covered bulletin boards, and every neighbor was handed evidence packets filled with her fabricated reports. The setup was designed to paint us as reckless and dangerous. Elaine began her performance with the confidence of a prosecutor. She accused us of turning our property into a hazard by defying legitimate oversight and rejecting the inspections of so-called municipal experts. She gestured dramatically at her charts, weaving a narrative of us as defiant and uncooperative owners endangering everyone around us. Some neighbors nodded, clearly persuaded by the apparent professionalism of her presentation. But then Emily stood, calm, steady, and resolute. She asked to speak. Elaine tried to shut her down, insisting the meeting was for HOA business only. But the neighbors demanded to hear our side. Emily walked to the front, connected her laptop to the sound system, and announced she had something every homeowner needed to hear. She pressed play on a 911 recording. Elaine's voice filled the room, describing us as suspicious individuals vandalizing infrastructure and demanding immediate police response. Gasps rippled through the audience as neighbors realized she had lied to emergency services, twisting routine lock replacement into a supposed criminal incident requiring multiple patrol cars. Emily paused the recording to explain that filing false reports to 911 is itself a federal crime and not a matter of HOA enforcement. She then let the rest of the call play, including the part where Elaine mentioned Robert's development company. As the connection between harassment and profit became clear, faces around the room hardened with anger. Next, Emily rolled out the photographic evidence of fake badges, counterfeit court orders, and the forged lien notice. She walked everyone through each piece, explaining how Elaine had escalated from lying to dispatchers to impersonating government officials, committing multiple federal crimes along the way. I watched neighbors' expressions shift from doubt to outrage. Those who had once signed Elaine's petition against us began apologizing, horrified that they had unknowingly supported a criminal scheme. And then, as if on cue, the back doors opened. Detective Morrison entered with 2 federal agents who had been monitoring the meeting. She stepped to the front of the room and announced that the FBI had been conducting surveillance on Elaine Collins for systematic property fraud at Broken Bar. The room froze when Detective Morrison announced that the FBI had been monitoring Elaine's activities and that the entire meeting was being recorded as part of a federal prosecution into organized property fraud. Neighbors exchanged uneasy glances as the reality sank in of the emergency HOA session had just flipped from a staged witch hunt into the opening act of a federal takedown. The escalation became official that Thursday morning. Emily and I were having breakfast on the deck, pretending for a moment that life was normal, when 2 federal agents walked up our path. Special Agent Williams, White Collar Crime Division, introduced herself. With her was Agent Rodriguez from the Dodge, a prosecutor specializing in abuse of emergency services and fraudulent authority schemes. They spread thick case files across our kitchen table and told us bluntly, our evidence was one of the cleanest, most complete records of organized harassment they'd ever seen. For hours, we walked them through the timeline: 911 abuse, fake inspectors, forged legal notices, escalating intimidation. Rodriguez pointed out that Elaine's pattern was textbook organized crime: start small, test boundaries, then escalate when no one pushes back. It wasn't neighbor drama. It was deliberate criminal planning. What shocked me most was their reveal. The FBI had been quietly investigating HOA-linked corruption for over a year. Elaine and Robert weren't freelancing as they'd been running the same playbook in at least 4 other lake communities, coercing owners to sell under fabricated government pressure. At least 12 families had already lost properties in this way, generating millions for Robert's development company. Our documentation, they said, was the missing puzzle piece that allowed prosecutors to finally move. Then came the pitch. They wanted us to participate in a sting. Emily and I would act like we'd given up, ready to sell the cabin at a loss just to escape the pressure. The FBI would wire us up, record everything, and let Elaine and Robert incriminate themselves with their own words and fake officials. It was the kind of operation you see on TV, but now it was our cabin, our lives. The following Wednesday, Emily and I sat in our living room, following a script written by the Bureau. We called Elaine, pretending we were exhausted and desperate. She bid immediately, promising to bring Robert and federal compliance officers that same afternoon to finalize transfer discussions. They arrived like clockwork at Robert with bogus contracts, 2 men in cheap suits posing as federal officials, and Elaine smiling like she had finally won. They pushed us hard: sign today, avoid penalties, walk away before federal investigations ruined us completely. Robert offered a price far below market, justifying it with made-up compliance costs. Emily played her part perfectly, nervous and defeated, asking if this was the only way to stop the harassment. Elaine leaned in close, assuring her this was the solution to the selling meant peace. That's when the door burst open. Agent Williams entered with 3 federal agents, announcing the arrests. Robert, Elaine, and their officers froze mid-sentence as badges and cuffs appeared. In less than 10 minutes, contracts were seized, equipment bagged, and their entire operation shut down. Elaine's triumphant mask collapsed into raw fear as she realized the meeting wasn't her Victoria, it was the sting that ended everything. Months later, Emily and I sat in federal court watching them face the consequences. Elaine and Robert pled guilty rather than face a jury. The scope of their fraud came out in full. Over $8 million in stolen value, 12 families targeted, years of intimidation disguised as HOA enforcement. Elaine admitted to using her clerk's background to forge credentials and documents. Robert admitted to laundering the acquisitions into his luxury development projects. Emily gave a victim impact statement that silenced the room. She told the judge how a simple lock replacement on her grandfather's gate had spiraled into federal crime because of greed. She described the fear of seeing fake officers at our door, the humiliation of flashing police lights over nothing, the trauma of being made to feel like a criminal on our own property. When my turn came, I told the court that maintaining our cabin as something my grandfather taught me was a privilege. Had been twisted into grounds for harassment. Elaine and Robert had turned a $20 lock into the trigger for a federal case. The judge sentenced Elaine to 18 months in prison plus probation. Row.